Nerd morning, everyone. My name is Jeremy, and today we are going to be breaking down the history of the DC universe and look at what the future is going to bring in terms of the DC universe moving forward. So with that, we have to look at the history. We have to kind of pedal back and explore things. And I'm going to be going pretty vague on certain elements, and then when it gets more to some of the more current last 15 years of the DC Comics universe, we're going to go in a little bit more detail and how this is going to intertwine into what's going to be called the Infinite Frontier, as well as Future State for DC Comics. So the DC Multiverse is something that I think is really key to understand. So the Multiverse is essentially this expanding of the various characters that they could have a Prime Earth Superman and then an Earth 2 Superman, and they could be different characters or reimagined in different ways. They did this even farther with stories that they called Elseworld stories. Now, these were stories that were like Gotham by Gaslight, which was a Victorian imagining of Batman way back in time, and they had this exciting murder mystery Batman adventure, but it was obviously at a different time period than Batman. They also had things like a vampire version of Batman, and they were able to explore those things with stories that they called Elseworld. So noting that there have been multiple versions of these characters, different things that they've done, we also, in the main timeline, have had a very long period where they've had these main continuous stories. Like for Batman and Superman, they've had over 80 years worth of stories, and these are with regular issues coming out, sometimes multiple issues for a character every month. Now, with that, that's a ton of history for comic readers to remember and to need to rely on for future stories. And so with the New 52, they did a major reboot where they essentially tried to compress the history down and make it so certain things happened, certain things didn't, and made it so it was a really easy start for new readers for DC Comics. What this did, though, however, is take a lot of the richness and certain things that some readers that were longtime readers really loved, and they kind of lost certain elements of that. So with New 52, I hear a lot of mixed feelings. Some people say, wow, it was amazing. It was the thing that got me starting to read comics. Other people say, oh, they missed out on this and this and this. And honestly, both are true and valid. Now, with this, though, they had this time break. They had certain things that were disconnected, and they wanted to try to be able to reintroduce or re-explore some of those things in the future, and that's where we get stuff like where we're at right now. Going backwards in time just a little bit farther, we have Dark Knight's DC's Metal. Now, this was an event that they did a couple years ago now, and they introduced the Dark Multiverse. People like the Batman Who Laughs and other darker versions of the characters. Essentially, this is a multiverse story like Earth 2 or something like that, except these versions were the dark versions, the tragedies, the recreations of these heroes into their most villainous dark forms, and they were super fun, and people really responded with that. So they decided to help deal with this disconnect by telling the story DC Dark Knight's Death Metal. Now, in Death Metal number 7, we get an explanation of this essentially unreboot that DC Comics is trying for. Now, what this did is at the end of Dark Knight's Death Metal, they had this event that made it so people would now remember their past. So these forgotten pasts, things that had happened before the New 52 reboot, those things are now able to be recalled and remembered as part of their history. And they also are accepting that there are multiple pasts. And so if there were certain events in one timeline and certain events in another timeline, they both exist. That's already super potentially confusing and problematic, but they are going to be trying in the future to deal with the DC universe that way in response to both New 52 and the things that had happened before. Also, they're going to be talking about how there's multiple futures, things like Future State, which is a event that's happening in January and February. These are going to be stories of a possible future or a future that exists right here, and they're saying that that can exist as well as things like the future with Batman Beyond, how this future and this future can both exist. Now, this really makes me feel like a multiverse like we've had already, so I'm not too concerned, only that with the increase of the fissuring that we're having, it's going to be hard for certain readers to keep track of everything. But they're not stopping there. They're talking about how there's not just a multiverse anymore, but essentially an omniverse, where there are multiverses of multiverses. Now, this might help explain things like DC Superhero Girls, which is a young children's show, and the characters and all those types of things are done in different ways than they would have in the main comics. And maybe they're trying to be able to help incorporate and grab hold of some of those type of imaginings of the DC universe in this omniverse approach. Also, with this omniverse and these different timelines, they're also going to be resurrecting some dead characters that were not simply killed off in the DC Death Metal event, but ones that had died and gone away previous to that. So they're essentially saying any of our characters are now up for grabs to have stories told and to do other things with, if the story requires it and the occasion arises. Now, they also had one other major shift. So they say there's no longer a singular prime Earth at the center. There are now two centers. Now, this is essential because previously to this, we would say that there is a prime Earth, which is the main continuity. This is the continuity of the main Batman stories, the main Superman stories, the main Wonder Woman stories, etc., and how they intertwined in the main timeline, the main story. And anything that was outside of that would be an Earth 2 or an Elseworld story or something like that inside of the multiverse. Now they're saying there are two centers. One center they're calling Prime Earth, which is going to be the main story, the main continuity. And the other one, they haven't given a ton of details except for calling it the Elseworld. Now, this makes me think of the Elseworld stories, again, those stories like Vampire Batman or Gotham by Gaslight, which were very unique, different Elseworld stories of these characters and reimaginings in very different ways. And saying that that is a center of the multiverse as well as the Prime Earth will be a very interesting thing to figure out moving forward inside of the DC universe. Now, all of this stuff is pushing towards what DC is calling Infinite Frontier, which is going to be starting up in March of 2020. Now, this is kind of like their New 52 or their Rebirth. This is what I think this new era of the DC universe is going to be called, the Infinite Frontier. And it's going to be all of this. Now, this means we might be seeing more Elseworld stories, or we may be seeing stories of different characters all at the same times. So if there was a character in Future State that worked really, really well, people resonate with, they might do a Future State version of that character over here, and then the main timeline story over here. All of those types of things seem to be possible with this new structure and formula that the DC Comics has set up. There seems to be a big open expanse of possibility, and that I'm really, really excited for. I think on the downside, this could potentially be confusing again for readers, but I think the trade-off of having so many opportunities for different stories, reimaginings of characters, things like that will be really, really fun. Me personally, I love adaptations. I think that those are really cool and interesting to see how people can remix an idea and create something new. Thus, I really enjoyed Elseworld stories. I really enjoyed Multiverse stories. So for me personally, this is a big win. What are some of your guys' thoughts about the future for DC Comics? Let me know. Put those in the comments below. I'd be fascinated to hear. Also, you guys can support me by checking out my other social media platforms like Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Nerd Morning. Thank you guys so much again for watching, and I will catch you guys next time.